Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Turner here. You're welcome to read along with me, or you can mute the sound and read yourselves. You can also read the PDF that's been attached with this week's work. Please make sure you have a go at the Kahoot once you've read the Possum Problem. Okay, so let's start reading. The Possum Problem by Joanna Knox. Possums, you hardly ever see them, but they're all around. In the bush, on farms, in parks. They might even be in your garden. During the day, possums stay in their dens. They are dry, hidden places where they won't be disturbed. Possums emerge after dark, millions upon millions of them, all across New Zealand. Slowly but surely, possums are changing our forests for the worst. Possums devour the fruit and flowers that many of our native creatures need to survive. They also devour the native creatures. These include birds, bats, and insects. Possums like leaves too, especially new growth on rata and kamahi. Losing their leaves eventually causes the trees to die. Slowly but surely, possums are changing our forests for the worst. Of course, this isn't what the settlers had in mind when they brought these furry marsupials to New Zealand. Just move me out of the way. A fondness for fur. When the first British settlers arrived in Aotearoa, there were no animals that could be hunted for their fur. Australia had the bush-tail possum, and hunters there made good money selling the creature's warm, silky fur. Hunters here wanted the same opportunity, so they decided to ship possums from Australia. The plan was for the animals to breed and start colonies. Then New Zealand could have a fur industry too. Our first shipment of possums arrived in 1837. A few decades later, small populations of possums dotted the country. Fur hunters were delighted. No one could guess at the environmental disaster to come. After all, possums hadn't caused problems in Australia. Why would things be different here? The idea to introduce possums here was supported by a special groups called Acclimatization Societies. These societies, which sprang up in the 1860s, wanted to supply all the important species that New Zealand was missing. Species were chosen for a variety of reasons. Deer and rabbits and trout were shipped over for sport. Horse and bullocks were brought for transport. Blackbirds and oak trees were chosen because they reminded the early settlers of home. Acclimatization societies also believed in supporting new industry. They were very much in favour of possums because the species would help to establish a fur trade. For over 50 years, acclimatization societies organised the shipment and release of hundreds of possums in New Zealand. Writing about this work in 1917, one enthusiast said, "We shall be doing a great service to the country in stocking these large areas with this valuable and harmless animal." Ticket to Paradise. Back in Australia, life was hard for possums. They endured an extreme climate with harsh cold and searing heat. In summer, wildfires tore through the bush, incinerating everything in their paths. Australia was also packed with predators, all of them competing for food. Eggs and small animals were a rare, protein-rich treat for possums. Mostly they lived on leaves, bark, and flowers. But even maintaining this diet could be hard work. The Australian bush was thinly spread. Any kind of food was hard to find. Other predators weren't just competition for food either. The bigger species, such as pythons, dingoes, and goannas, saw possums as prey. Tiger quolls, cat-sized marsupials, killed possums with a bite to the neck, even though the two species were the same size. After the tough Australian environment, the New Zealand bush was paradise. It was lush and damp with mild temperatures. The kinds of trees that possums found most delicious grew in abundance. There was also plenty of easy meat. New Zealand's native animals had never dealt with a predator like the possum before. Most of them were no good at hiding or escaping. Some native birds couldn't even fly, although their chicks were the most vulnerable. What's more, here in New Zealand, the new arrivals had a guaranteed spot at the top of the food chain. I'll just move that up so you can see that. There was plenty for possums to eat and nothing to eat them. Possums also had a new trick. In Australia, a female possum gave birth to one young a year. She'd only have a second joey if there was lots of food to eat. Usually there wasn't. In New Zealand, there was so much good food. A female could easily have 2 babies a year. In this way, possum numbers built up fast. Soon, they would produce a population explosion. Let's move that up the way. Trouble. At first, settlers didn't notice what possums were doing to the forests, but they did see the harm to their fruit trees and gardens. With no predators about, possums boldly came out of the bush to explore. They found their way into farm crops, orchards, and backyards. Then they had a feast. By the 1920s, people were arguing about possums. Many had finally begun to notice possums' damage to the forest, and farmers and gardeners were fed up. They demanded the right to kill possums. At the time, only trappers with a license could do this, and they wanted no more possums to be brought here. Fur trappers were against these ideas. Their income came from selling possum skins. They didn't want things to change. For several decades, the government tried to keep everyone happy. Laws were changed again and again, but the negative effect of possums on the environment had become impossible to ignore, and more people cared about stopping it. In 1947, after much debate, the government removed all restrictions on the taking of possums. The species was no longer protected, and people were allowed to use poison to control their numbers. At the same time, the government began working on its own plan to reduce the possum population. Over the next 4 decades, despite people's hard work, the number of possums grew. By 1980, possums were found in over 90% of the country. Around 1/3 of them now live in the South Island, and the rest are in the North Island, which has more of the kinds of trees that possums prefer. These days, many groups such as regional councils, the Department of Conservation, and conservation groups work together to reduce the possum population. Hunters and farmers track possums too. People use a variety of methods for control, including shooting, trapping, and poison. The best method depends on how easy it is to get to the possums, the number of possums in the area, and what other non-target species are around. And you can see the distribution of possums and how it has grown since the 1930s to most parts of New Zealand. Possums and bovine tuberculosis. In the 1960s, yet another possum problem emerged. Scientists realized that possums were carrying and spreading bovine tuberculosis, TB, a disease they caught from infected cattle. Bovine tuberculosis spreads very easily, and cows can become reinfected after sniffing and licking infected possums that have come out of the bush to die. In the past, large numbers of cows became infected with the disease and needed to be killed. This cost farmers millions of dollars. Now, thanks to possum control and herd testing, the extent of the problem has been greatly reduced. Okay, move that out of the way. There are risks with using poison. Some poisons occasionally kill native animals or people's dogs. However, a lot of people believe that a small amount of bykill is acceptable. The number of native creatures saved from possums is far greater than the number killed by poison, and scientists are constantly working on new ways to make sure only the pests eat the poison. Today, around 30 million possums live in New Zealand. That's a lot, but it's a big improvement on the 1980s, when there were twice as many. Although the number is going down, most scientists believe our furry friends are here to stay. Getting rid of every last one would take too much time and money. One day, there might be a breakthrough. In the meantime, we can only control the possum population so the damage they cause isn't too great. And you can see a glossary there of some of the terms. So you can pause this and have a look at that if you want to just check your understanding of any of the words. And then we've got a nice little instruction here about how to recognise possums in your own garden or whenua, and then some ideas about what you can do about getting rid of them. Okay, well, thanks very much, guys, for reading along with me. Make sure that you have a go at the Kahoot. Ka kite anō.